Hello everyone, this is going to be a Unit 5 review video for political participation. The social problem that we addressed in this review video was populism. I'm going to try to keep this very short. So right here, you can see legal protections found in the 15th, 17th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. So go ahead and pause the video so you can get these amendments down. You need to memorize these amendments for the semester exam. But these amendments help expand access to voting that's the common theme of these amendments. Then we talked about political models that explain voting behavior. We talked about, I'm going to skip rational choice for now and move to retrospective voting. Retrospective voting is voting to decide whether the party or candidate in power should be reelected based on the recent past. Prospective voting, voting based on predictions of how a party or candidate will perform in the future. Party line voting, supporting a party by voting for candidates from one political party for all public offices at the same level of government. We talked about how it's not very common for instance, a Trump supporter to vote for Democrats on the bottom of the ticket, or it's not very common for a Biden supporter to vote for Republicans further down the ticket. Usually there's party line voting, voting straight Republican, voting straight Democrat is pretty common. But there are some instances and interesting instances where either the person at the top of the ticket, usually the president in presidential election years, underperforms or overperforms people below the ticket, and political scientists are usually very interested in that underperformance or overperformance. And it looks like President Trump, for instance, underperformed in one state in particular. The Georgia Senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler in the 2020 election. So political scientists are trying to explain why this is so. So I'll include a link in the description, or not just political scientists, journalists. I'll include a link in the description so you can see. Rational choice is an interesting. It's voting based on what is perceived to be in the citizen's individual interests. Oftentimes, interests are defined as material interests, usually monetary interests. But there's actually an interesting Yale lecture from Professor Ian Shapiro. I think it's titled, where is it? The Building Blocks of Distributive Politics, which explains that there are several different dimensions and values that go into a vote aside from a material interest based voting. So for example, we discussed how they're, defining interest narrowly as material. There may be perceived to be some Trump supporters or Biden supporters that quote unquote voted against their own interests. Maybe a Trump supporter that is heavily dependent on social welfare programs that Republican politicians tend to not be as friendly towards, or a Biden supporter that is a wealthy lawyer. And we talked about how lawyers from elite law schools tend to be very liberal. A Biden supporter, making upwards of $600,000, may be perceived as voting against their own interests because Republicans generally have tax policies that are friendlier to people that pay high or large amounts of taxes, and so forth. But there are several other dimensions, right, that go into the Trump supporters and the Biden supporters in these particular scenarios, aside from a material interest-based or interest-based conception or material-based conception of interest. Yeah, it's interesting in this rational choice model, how would interest be defined? Cool. Then we talked about what influences voter turnout. So we talked about national versus state-controlled elections. We talked about voter registration laws and procedures, voting incentives or penalties or fines, election type, midterm or presidential. For example, this is another evidence of federalism. We talked about federalism in Unit 1. Federalism, remember, is the sharing of power between state and local government, or the sharing of power between the federal government and state and local governments. But we said that the reserved powers for the states and the arenas in which the state has a preponderant control over, that this tends to produce inequalities in terms of how states address specific issues. So from education, there may be different states prioritizing and investing more in education than other states. Some of us like federalism, some of us don't like federalism, but in our country, states have wide discretion over how an election is conducted within their state. And so these are, I think this is states where photo ID is required, or some form of and in this map you can see this is from the cost of voting index. The green states are the states where it's easiest to get a ballot and to vote in the United States, and the most difficult is here. And there can be different types of laws and inhibitions, voter registration laws, voter ID law. I discussed how in 2016 I voted in Washington, D.C., and I believe, if I remember correctly, I registered to vote on the same day. That's not possible in Texas. So Washington, D.C., it's much easier to vote than in Texas. All that type of stuff. Midterm elections tend to have lower turnout than presidential elections. People are really excited by the presidential elections, not so much by midterms. And it was long thought that Republicans have advantage in off-year elections. But here's a link that maybe suggests that's sort of was at least a myth in the last midterm election. So yeah, cool. So this is from Northern Illinois University. These are key characteristics of easy-to-vote states as they define it. So registration deadlines allow voters to register as late as Election Day. Voter regulation restrictions provide online voter registration, hold Election Day registration at the polling place, and avoid restriction on voters with cognitive disabilities or felony convictions. Automatic voter registration automatically registers state residents who are eligible to vote. Voter ID laws don't require a voter ID, just require signature, early voting, mail-in voting. So these are characteristics of easy-to-vote states. We talked about voter ID laws in the context of talking about the Supreme Court striking down of Shelby County versus Holder, which is a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. So this is according to Northern Illinois University, the easiest states to vote and the most difficult states to vote. Federalism producing inequalities. Again, maybe we like this, maybe we don't. I talked about voting rights for formerly incarcerated people. Predictably, in voting rights for formerly incarcerated people are more restrictive in some of the states that had some of the voter ID laws and where it was said that voting in the United States was most difficult. So Texas being one of them. So democratic characteristics, we'll skip that. We talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we talked about how it prohibited the denial or the abridgment of the right to vote on the account of race or color. It came roughly a year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The effects of the Voting Rights Act on minority enfranchisement were immediate. Between 1964 and 1968 presidential elections, Black voter registration rates increased 67% among Southern states. And then we talked about the mechanisms in which the Voting Rights Act accomplished it. So first, it prohibited literacy tests, which had been used sort of as a proxy for race to disenfranchise Southern Blacks. We also talked about the second and more controversial mechanism that was effectively neutered by the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder, where states that had jurisdiction subject, states, predominantly those of the former Confederacy, that had engaged in discriminatory voting practices were required under the Voting Rights Act to seek pre-clearance. They were required to either go to the Justice Department or a federal court to if they wanted to change their voting laws, to prove that their voting laws were not designed to be discriminatory. Yeah, and this, as you can see, the John Lewis famously getting attacked by Alabama state troopers in the and this, you can see this dramatized in the movie Selma, which is incredibly good. The Voting Rights Act was, one of the key provisions of the civil rights, key pieces of legislation in the civil rights era. In Shelby County versus Holder, however, in 2013, the Supreme Court eviscerated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 of the law required jurisdictions with a history of discrimination to obtain approval before changing voting rules. This process, known as pre-clearance, blocked discrimination before it occurred. In Shelby County versus Holder, the court invalidated Section 4, which determines the states and localities covered by Section 5. Ruling Congress must pass a new formula to determine which states and localities would be subject to pre-clearance. The ruling had the effect of eliminating pre-clearance, ushering in a wave of efforts in states previously covered on Section 5 to restrict voting rights. This is from the Brendan Center on Justice, but we did a sort of concept application question with this. We did this together in class. So the Shelby County versus Holder decision was really kind of ushered in a wave of voter ID laws that critics derided as attempts to disenfranchise predominantly minority and poor voters, orchestrated by Republicans to reduce the voting power of groups that were likely going to vote Democratic. I'll include an article about this decision. We talked about how the Supreme Court decided this 5-4, how Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissented, and she talked about she was very critical of the holding, her dissent was widely read and kind of kickstarted her late stage career as kind of a cultural icon. So the social problem that we use to kind of organize our thinking around this unit was populism. Before I define populism, I want to define what a political party is. And we discussed that parties promote a partisan conception of the public interest. What we mean by partisan is the conception of the public interest. They often, suggest that their platform is what's best for the United States, not for, just their voters exclusively. They talk about, about the United States in general, their ideals being the most important, and their policies being most important to make the United States stronger and more well off. We talked about political parties as linkage institutions. Here are the function of modern political parties, but we also discussed this trend of political parties gradually becoming weaker in the United States, which has helped contribute to the rise of populism in the United States. We discussed this thesis, The Party Decides, articulated by a Georgetown professor and other authors, but the Georgetown professor part is the most interesting, which said that despite the fact that political primaries in the around the 1960s became democratized, party elites still tried to pick who became the standard bearer of the political party with endorsements, with attempts to funnel cash into political candidates and so forth. But obviously in the 2016 election, we saw one party successfully decide who was going to be the standard bearer, albeit with an unlikely challenge from Bernie Sanders, that standard bearer being Hillary Clinton. And we saw another party unsuccessfully decide who would be the standard bearer, Donald Trump was not very well liked. Then candidate Trump was not very well liked by Republican Party elites, but he somehow managed to capture the Republican Party nomination and then catapult into becoming president of the United States. We also talked about how we have a two-party system. We talked about Duverger's law, and the U.S. political system is set up for two major parties because it awards seats in Congress and the presidency with the winner-take-all method. And this is the logic behind Duverger's law, is that third parties can't compete because there's no prize for winning, for example, 15 to 25% of the vote. In like a single district, there's no prize for winning 15 to 25% of the vote. This leads voters to choose candidates who are more likely to win, and it leads the parties to try to broaden their appeal to half the electorate and ideally more. So the way that our political system, our political system is set up, creates a two-party system. If we had a sort of proportional representation in Congress, like other democracies have, specifically Germany, we would have a multi-party system. There are, benefits to both systems, I would argue, but take comparative political systems in college if you want to know more about a multi-party system. So we also said that political parties consist of combinations groups with which consist of combinations of individuals. The larger the coalition, the more likely the candidate will win. So we said in a two-party system, there's this attempt to try to cultivate the median voter to make sure that you kind of know if you're on the political party on the right, that the far most extreme elements of the right, if you rush to the center, that they're going to have to vote for you nonetheless because they don't want the other political party to win. So there's this, in theory, this chasing of the median voter in two-party political systems. Now what we see is, like in political primaries, this attempt to consolidate either a very liberal or very conservative base, and then in the primary, this attempt to rush towards the middle and chase the median voter. So we discussed populism a little bit. We said populism claims to speak on behalf of the ordinary people against a corrupt elite. Populism, we said there can be left-wing populists, there can be right-wing populists. There's left-wing populists and right-wing populists throughout the world. The way in which populism becomes a bit problematic, we discussed, is sometimes they offer snake oil to problems that are deeply complicated and rooted in long-standing historical, social, cultural, and economic issues, but they are, populists tend to be very disruptive, and it's a sort of style of politics that tends to be very effective. So here's Marine Le Pen. You can see en nom des peuples, in the name of the people. This is Hugo Chavez, this is a populist, and Maduro is a populist. Bolsonaro de Duterte. And the paradox of populism, we said, is in its extreme forms, populism is the mechanism that poses the greatest threat to democratic institutions. Oftentimes, when populists gain power, they already have a lot of the rhetoric of a corrupt elite operating in the highest level of government, and they often can blame their own failures. It's fixing a lot of the society's problems on that elite, and that's oftentimes what happens. They're already opposed to the institutions that exist, so they tend to be very disruptive forces. And we said that populism is therefore interconnected with the other social problem that we discussed in Unit 2 of authoritarianism, which we defined as sabotaging democratic accountability by means of disinformation, secrecy, and disabling voice. We said in its most extreme forms, one of the things that sustains populism is conspiracy theories. We have QAnon. Here's a great resource on QAnon from The Atlantic. The Bush did 9/11 conspiracy theory. They can really help sustain populism. So we talked about longstanding economic, social, and political sources of populism. So this may be a preview to Mr. Diaz's AP macroeconomics class, which he is not going to teach, or maybe to only a select few students, but I'm for sure teaching microeconomics next semester. But we talked about the different psychological dimensions that go into voting. We talked about loss aversion mattering more than sort of inequality that exists. So people are very sensitive to the things that they lose, less so than the things that they gain. And so often couching a political message in terms of you lost something is very effective, especially in a world where we see wage stagnation. We'll talk more about wage stagnation, but basically it means that wages are not keeping pace with worker productivity. We live in a world where organized labor is weaker than it was in previous decades. Here you can see the amount of union membership in the United States. Business interests are stronger than in previous decades. Globalization is in full steam. Companies are outsourcing jobs to other countries that and people are feeling a lot of economic and social insecurity and dislocation. But also there's a political element to this, is political parties have become more weak and fragmented everywhere. So we talked about previously how in the 1960s there was this effort to democratize political primaries, and this democratization of parties has weakened parties because although the elites can still signal who that they prefer, oftentimes in political primaries, they are very low turnout primaries, and it's oftentimes the most liberal or conservative members of those primaries that turn out to vote, and they can really drive parties further and further to the ideological edges. And maybe you like this, maybe you're at that ideological edge and you think that that's where the right side of history is, but it really inhibits consensus building within our institutions that require a great deal of consensus and that are designed to be slow moving and to stop impulsive governmental decisions and policy making. And so it kind of has led to a fracture in our compromise building in Washington. Here's some more evidence of some of the wealth and economic trends that exist. Wealth estimates. So the share of wealth going to the top 1% of Americans, you can see in the US increasingly share of wealth going. We can see productivity and wage compensation not keeping up. And this is just, we're going to talk more about this later. We talked about the politics of insecurity. So specifically, people make local comparisons rather than global comparisons. And so despite the fact that there's a lot of wealth accruing to the richest 1% of Americans, people oftentimes make very local comparisons to people, that are living down the street. They care more about that. And so that sort of politics that focuses on maybe local anxiety, maybe there's anxiety about racial integration, or there's anxiety related to the fact that you're left out of work, but so many people in the surrounding communities are doing better. That sort of politics that capitalizes on that rather than the sort of politics that capitalizes on the fact that wealth has accrued to the richest 1% of Americans is more effective, because people often make very local comparisons. Here are interest groups. We talked about interest groups are organizations dedicated to a particular political goal or set of unified goals. We often think of interest groups very negatively, but there are a lot of interest groups that some of us may like depending on our ideological leanings, like the American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP, which was responsible for those court cases that we feel are super important, like Brown versus Board of Education. or a National Rifle Association, which some of us may view very negatively or some of us may view very positively. And here's, universities even have lobbying arms to try to get this sort of legislation that they want in Congress. So that's Georgetown's lobbying arm. And then these are the different mechanisms. Lobbyists can testify before Congress. They can make political donations, endorsements. They can even file amicus briefs, which are friends of the court briefs, which are the ways in which lobbyists can try to influence court decisions. They can rally their membership. They can make ads, all sorts of stuff. Then this brings us to money in politics. We talked about money in politics. I talked about open Yale courses and how important and informative they were into my high school experience, although I did graduate valedictorian in my class. A little bit of a flex. Open Yale courses and those courses that I took on my own were actually more conducive to my success in college than my high school education. There's a lot you can do on your own to really allow yourself to be successful in college. So this comes directly from your lecture. I'll just include it from the Ian Shapiro lecture that you should have watched. There was a series of Supreme Court decisions, starting with Buckley versus Vallejo, that expanded the ability for political, expanded or gradually reduced weakened laws on campaign contributions and expenditures through the mechanism of judicial review. And so we talked about this. This is one of your essay prompts that you can write about for your semester exam review, whether we think that this mechanism of judicial review is important for preserving democratic institutions or protecting vulnerable groups. And the court has a history going back to Buckley versus Vallejo as expanding the ability for people to make political contributions, or for the very wealthy to make increasing political contributions and expenditures in our society. So in Buckley versus Vallejo, you can see the holding: okay to limit contributions to specific campaigns because there's a risk of corruption, but not okay to limit expenditures, meaning the amount someone spends. Because of the First Amendment, not okay to limit candidates' use of personal funds, not okay to level playing field. And then we can see the assumptions that are embedded in this ruling. Money is speech. Government interest in leveling the playing field is not compelling, so must give way to a fundamental right. The only corruption worth worrying about is quid pro quo. We'll talk more about this later. And then, of course, the Citizens United decision, which basically said Congress may not limit independent corporate expenditures. There is limits on campaign contributions. You can only give $2,700 to a political campaign. There's no limits on expenditures, meaning you can give $2,700 to every single member of Congress if you so desire, but you don't necessarily have to give to a political campaign. You can also give to super PACs and political action committees and spend unlimited amounts of money in our election. And then the assumptions in the Citizens United decision in 2010 was corporations have the same free speech rights as individuals. Government interest in leveling the playing field is not compelling. The only corruption worth worrying about is quid pro quo. And so what a quid pro quo is type corruption scenario is when someone specifically gives money to someone else in exchange for something, right? So there may not be like a formal agreement of it's unlawful to specifically say I'm going to give you a campaign expenditure of $2,700, but I expect that you do something for me. That type of stuff is unlawful, but there's almost a tacit agreement, right? If you're a candidate, that you're getting $2,700 from somebody or somewhere, and you're probably, to keep those persons funding your campaign, you're probably going to sponsor legislation or support legislation or not support legislation that is in keeping with the interests of the people that are giving you that money. So then we talked about super PACs. Political action committees can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money from corporations, unions, individuals, and associations. We talked about two types of super PACs, 527 or 501c4. Here you can see the 527 and the 501c4. Go ahead and pause the video if you so desire. We talked about the election cycle, nominations, general elections, closed primaries, and open primaries. Go ahead and get those terms down. These are the steps towards presidential nomination. Presidential nominations require a lot of endurance. They often last close to 2 years and tons of money, right? Our political system does require tons of money to sustain it. We talked about the importance of national conventions. They're kind of used as a sort of PR as well, and to kind of unify political parties going into the election. And then this is just kind of stuff that we all know, general election and the Electoral College. And all done. Boom.